Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts today, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the National Emergency Management Association, and the CHDS Alumni Association, thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is the second in a three-part series examining housing and sheltering during the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier in our series, we discussed how housing and shelter operations are affected during disasters such as hurricanes and wildfires, and how those have shifted in the middle of the coronavirus outbreak. Today's webinar, our panel is going to continue the housing and sheltering discussions with a focus on vulnerable populations and those who are experiencing homelessness. We will consider lessons learned from all stages of the pandemic response, and we'll also talk about emerging model practices in housing and sheltering operations. A couple of quick administrative notes before we get into our session today. All participant audio is muted, and all questions will be held until after our speakers' initial comments. Throughout the session, you're encouraged to submit questions using the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll answer as many of your live questions as time allows. We also received several questions in advance, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible as well. Today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be posted to the CHDS Executive Education Program website after today's session. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey, and we ask that you share your thoughts on today's program before signing off. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's webinar. Clark Kimmerer is the retired Assistant Chief of Police of Seattle, where he served 31 years, the last 16 years of which as second in command as both Chief of Staff and Chief of Operations. Clark also served as the Director of Seattle's Emergency Operations Center, coordinating all city operations during activation for natural disasters as well as terrorist attacks. At CHDS, Clark is a frequent moderator for our executive education seminars with local and state senior elected leaders around the country. And today, Clark's going to bring his experience from his role as Vice Chair of Seattle's Downtown Emergency Service Center and his position as their Board of Directors. Clark, before we get into today's conversation, I want to thank you for what you're doing and everything that all of our audience is doing to fight the battle of COVID pandemic every day. Now I'll turn it over to you to outline our program and introduce our panel.
Thank you, Dawn, and welcome to everyone. This is going to be a very interesting conversation today. I think it's a very virtual certainty that we're going to look back on 2020 as a year of crisis. But at our Center for Homeland Defense and Security, which is a FEMA program, we consider this to be a year of crisis leadership. COVID has been and remains the focal point of our challenges, but the attendant economic crisis, the issues of social justice and racial equity, as well as the co-occurring disasters that continue with predictable certainty that our communities confront, have shaped our society in a way that in a kind of positive way, we are looking to reinvent some of the very foundations of how we conduct ourselves as a free and open society. But there's one crisis that is occurring in addition to those others that has been with us for a long, long time. And that is the crisis of people, our fellow citizens, experiencing homelessness and oftentimes the co-occurring disorders of behavioral health crisis, of substance abuse and addictive disorders, and physical disabilities. That's our topic today. And with our panel, we will be examining this crisis of public health, of civic responsibility, and of humanity itself. Let me introduce our panel. We're very pleased to have them with us today. First, Dr. Donnell Harvin. He is the Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence for the Washington, D.C. Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management Services. Prior to his position at HCMA, he was Director of Special Investigations and Operations for New York City Medical Examiner's Office, and in New York for the Department of Health as its Chief Scientist researcher for radiological issues surrounding the BioWatch program. In addition to all of his other duties, and in his spare time, he's a professor at Georgetown University with focus upon emergency and disaster management and applied intelligence. Thank you, Donnell. Justin Brown, he's the chief of the Office of Emergency Management in DC for the Department of Human Services. So Justin is responsible for citywide disaster mass care, shelter, and rehousing, and is part of the DC COVID-19 incident management team. He's a career firefighter and paramedic. He's previously served as a deputy commissioner in Boston and as an interagency coordinator in New York City for the Office of Emergency Management. He holds a Master of Urban and Regional Planning from Georgetown and a Bachelor of Science in Health Sciences from George Washington University. He's also a graduate of the 2013 cohort of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard. And Daniel Malone, our practitioner, our touchstone into the real world of managing shelters and other systems that serve people experiencing homelessness. Executive Director, Downtown Emergency Service Center, my friend of many, many years. The DESC is located in Seattle and King County, nonprofit organization serving people experiencing homelessness and living with behavioral health disabilities and other serious conditions. Daniel has been at DESC for 31 years, so I think he started when he was about 10, and has been the executive director for the last 5 years. He's a national leader on Housing First and other progressive human service principles, and has provided technical assistance to human service organizations throughout the US and Canada. He's also the co-convener of the National Housing First Partners Conference. Daniel holds a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Washington. The content of this webinar was developed with your questions in mind. You had presented many, many thoughtful questions, both in the previous webinar of last week, as well as for this webinar. I've tried to coalesce as many as I can, combine them where possible, and I guarantee you in 75 minutes, we are not going to get to all of them, but we are going to try to get to as many of the really focal points that you are bringing up in our conversation. And we intend to get back to you, those that we didn't get to answer their comments or questions. So when the screen goes blank, it's not like we're done. We intend to continue this relationship and in the spirit of the center, continue to think about this toward the end of moving the ball down the field. This will be interactive. We will adopt a public health, public safety, and emergency management perspective on a lot of the things we're going to be examining. This series is founded on the Center for Homeland Defense and Security's founding philosophy, namely that our homeland security depends upon building community capacity and resiliency through rigorous problem solving. My colleagues all told me that I needed to give you a note of translation. When I use the term emergency shelter, it's a shorthand that is really aimed at the topic of the systems and facilities that provide either short or sometimes long-term shelter, with an emphasis on that word, for people experiencing homelessness. It is distinct from one of the kind of landmark programs and gold standards of the Downtown Emergency Service Center, which is permanent supportive housing. It may be a pathway. It hopefully will be a pathway for more and more folks. But the population we're going to be talking about today need a roof over their heads and some basic survival services at a minimum. And we want to make sure that that distinction is clear. So with that, let's start our conversation. Let's start with Donnell. So Donnell, in last week's webinar, you outlined the priority public health criteria that should govern congregate shelter facilities generally. We talked about disaster shelters last week. But turning to the specific topic today, what would you say are the key similarities and differences when you consider COVID-19 management of emergency shelters serving homeless people?
Well, thanks, Clark. So one thing we've learned from a public health perspective is that COVID-19 has revealed all of the underlying public health disparities that this nation has. Many public health people know it. Many human services folks have experienced this with their clients, but now the world can see. We learned from the New York Times yesterday that since May 8th, there's 8 million people that have been plunged into poverty. You combine that with HUD estimates on a regular year of 560,000 people experiencing persistent homelessness. And you have basically a clash of poverty, a clash of underlying health conditions, and a system that's probably taxed on a normal year. And this is what we're faced with. This is a crisis within a crisis. We probably should have talked about this over the summertime, but we're here now. Additionally, as the colder weather starts setting upon us, respiratory illnesses increase. Factors that lead to homelessness increase, including depression. And so once again, these things are a spiral and combine in a way that will tax the system even more when we start seeing increase in COVID cases, increase in people experiencing homelessness, and increase in poverty.
Daniel, why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about the Downtown Emergency Service Center, the populations, maybe the numbers, some of the programs, but then if you would then pivot to the unique challenges of managing probably the largest so-called emergency shelter for people experiencing homelessness in our region. And maybe again, begin to talk about where we are reimagining those facilities and services.
Yeah, thanks so much. Glad to be with you all. So the organization that I run is called DESC. We're a private nonprofit service provider in Seattle, and we're focused on trying to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness here, but especially a subgroup of people who have more profound challenges, the population that ends up being what is often referred to as chronically homeless. So that usually means people with significant behavioral health disabilities, such as serious mental illness, longstanding substance addiction, and increasingly, it's true in Seattle and it's true around the country, more medical issues that come with aging. The population of people experiencing homelessness is older than it used to be. And coming with that, especially following years on the streets, that really takes a toll on people, more and more complicating medical issues that have made the work more complicated in recent years. So the work we do includes survival services like shelters, which we're mostly going to be talking about today, but we also do a lot of permanent supportive housing, putting people up in apartments and bringing services to them that they receive voluntarily, but has proven to be the real solution to chronic homelessness. It gets people off the streets, out of shelters, and gives them a platform for achieving better health. And we're trying to do more and more of that, but we have not been able to bring it to scale that it's needed at. And so we keep running shelters too, because otherwise people with these kinds of serious conditions would be in much more precarious situations. And then finally, we've also stepped up to become a significant behavioral health treatment provider. We do a variety of outpatient and specialty care for people with serious mental illness and addiction problems, because otherwise it's a group of people that might go unserved in the more conventional system of care. And we're targeted to trying to meet the needs of those folks. So to kind of wrap up this part, I'd say a lot of the work we do is aimed at helping as many people as we can at a time. And that often means convening people into spaces such as emergency shelters, where we have long operated, frankly, crowded, large shelter settings that we have seen significant drawbacks to for decades, but we've continued to do it because we want to have people off the street, because that's presumably better for them. And then we also try to deliver a lot of our behavioral healthcare services by attracting people to come in and see us. So making settings where people can come in and get food, be able to take a shower, get their clothes washed, practical things, even when they might not be coming in because they want to talk to a counselor. And so COVID has really called into question the wisdom of bringing people into settings where they're going to be congregating with each other and crowded with each other. So it's caused us to take a different approach to a lot of our work that I think we're going to be getting into more here as we go along.
Yes, yes, you've teed this up, because what we're going to be talking with you next about is, well, what are those? What does that reinvention look like? And to include, of course, what are the challenges and obstacles? Justin, last week you talked about the operational kind of vision and requirements of managing hopefully decongregated populations in disaster shelters broadly. So what I'd like to like I asked Donnell, well, about the idea of emergency shelters for people experiencing homelessness. What are the kind of similarities and differences? And how do those things mesh? How do they potentially integrate or coalesce, if at all?
I think that, Donnell used the word revealed, right? So we've a lot of us that are, in this virtual room together have been aware of these challenges for a long time, and just how crowded, just how fragile some of our social systems that support the folks experiencing homelessness and those in poverty and health disparities really have been for so long. And this thing really, I think this crisis has really revealed for us where a lot of those frailties really exist. And so one of the things that we started looking at was, okay, well, normally we use congregate setting as a way, that is our shelter of last resort, right? Is the congregate shelter, whether that's in the homeless services world or the disaster world. And when that doesn't work, we see we have to expand our staff. We have to expand the facilities that are available. We have to expand the services that are available. Clark, Daniel just mentioned just some of the things, whether it's substance abuse or behavioral health, that we want to provide these services. And it's not just about being able to give somebody a hotel room, because they're going to import all of the challenges that they had with them where they came from. And so I think from an emergency management perspective, a lot of this is about investment. It's about the emergency management world looking much broader than just public safety, traditional public safety, about interops and how many fire trucks we're building and those kinds of things. But now really looking at health and human services as the front line of a lot of these disasters, and making really smart investments in our longer term social services that become our response to these disasters. Because as we discussed in the last webinar, this disaster is largely an exacerbation of existing social ills. And the fact is that we normally don't make a lot of plans for folks who are in that world of experiencing homelessness, because they're already encapsulated in social services and in our shelter system, and we're already caring for them in some ways. And now we actually have to take them out of that system and provide those services elsewhere so that we can de-densify the shelters and those sorts of things. And so I think we need to start looking more holistically about what really are our investments in public safety going to be, and broadening those to include our social services.
Great, thank you, Justin. So Daniel, back to you. It's very clear that the more or less traditional, densely populated congregate shelter systems are not going to be safe in the COVID environment, obviously, and they're not a great idea. If they ever were a good idea, they kind of were born of necessity. Walk us through what you're doing in DESC and what you're hearing from maybe some of your colleagues around the country about potentially a reimagining of the emergency shelter component of homeless services.
Yeah, thanks. So principally what we've done is recognize and call out that these crowded congregate settings are a disaster in the making for with a respiratory illness as severe as COVID was looking to be. And so we began to consider, how can we get these environments changed? How can we essentially spread people out across more space, even if it's the same number of people overall? And the first thing we were able to do was get a hold of a large, exhibition multipurpose space that the city had and made available to us so we could at least take some people out of one environment and spread them out across more space. And we were, pretty pleased with being able to do that very, very quickly. It moved from idea to implementation in about 48 hours. We, however, fairly quickly on realized that, this is probably not the end of what we need to be doing here, because we're still congregating people, even if they're more spread out. And remember, we're serving a population that is older and has much more significant underlying health conditions. And all signs early in the pandemic were that those are the people who need the most protection overall. Here in the Seattle area, we had the COVID killing people daily in a nursing home in particular. And our clients had similar kinds of physical presentation to folks in a nursing home. And so we needed to avoid that. And we at our organization began asking our local government partners, can you find some other space for us to move our operations to? And initially we had some philanthropic dollars and then some government dollars that allowed us to rent some motel rooms at other settings, not moving our operations there, but renting some spaces for some of our clients we deemed to be at greatest risk, but who could more or less live without the support of our staff 24/7. Then we were left with lots of other people, though, that we needed to help find a different environment for. And fortunately, our county government was able to rent an entire hotel property for our use. And we moved, for us, a very large emergency shelter, 250 people, to this other location, and where people could have individual rooms. And we knew at that point then that we were in a much better position to have people safer than they were in the congregate shelter setting. And we were able to move all of our staff there as well. We weren't able to serve more people and get more people off the streets, which was a major pressure we were feeling at the same time. But it was sort of a matter of priority. First things first, let's make sure we don't have this virus ravage through this vulnerable population group. And so we moved them into the hotel, and immediately saw not just the good effects of feeling that we were keeping people protected from the virus, but having so many other benefits that were clear right away, such as fewer crisis events, less agitation from people. This is a high behavioral health needs population group, and we're accustomed to a lot of chaos in our crowded shelter environments. We're also accustomed to knowing that stuff can go away when people get housed, and that's why we've worked most of our effort on getting people housed. But moving from the crowded shelter environment to a more housing-like environment, a hotel, produced these benefits rapidly and dramatically. And we went, for example, from having on average of 5+ emergency calls a day to our main emergency shelter for both police and fire matters, mostly medical matters, to about 1 every 2 days in this new setting, with really the same sets of services available to people, just an environment that is much more conducive to people being under much less stress and strain, and consequently less burden on our other local systems of emergency response.
Which are, of course, the concomitant benefits of doing it the right way, right? So the next question I'm going to ask you in a few minutes is, all right, now what's the future look like? And I know that you're having some challenges about the maintenance and expansion of this approach. I'd like to turn to Donnell. And, Donnell, you've been an avid student and even to some extent a participant in the development of standards like the CDC guidelines. FEMA has obviously weighed in with some very important guidance. But when you look at the specific, complexity of so-called emergency shelters serving homeless people, how transferable are those? How kind of is it aspirational or practical when we really dive into what all the experts are telling us need to be done?
That's a great question, Clark. This is really an all hands on deck situation. The infrastructure that supports human services cannot do this mission alone. I'll just give you some context from a public health standpoint. We talked about this last week, but now that we're talking about this particular topic, it's more germane. Daniel kept on mentioning is at-risk population and all the things he's seeing. Researchers in the University of California found that the persistent homeless population, those who are unsheltered, experience geriatric symptoms far younger than those who have homes. On average, 15 to 20 years, which means that if you follow the CDC guidelines of an at-risk individual for COVID at 65, you may see individuals who are 45 and 50 who have persistent geriatric symptoms, failure to thrive, inability to take care of themselves, incontinence, things you would not see until someone gets 65 or 75. You may see with the person coming through the doors at 50 or 55. Combine that with the fact that many of these individuals, they're persistently experiencing homelessness, are homeless because of an underlying health condition to start off with. So they're coming to you because of underlying health conditions. And many times they have, trimorbidities or trifecta of issues, physical, mental health, and substance abuse issues. And so it really breaks the paradigm. Now, the CDC has done a really good job in putting out guidance, and we'll post that for the participants. One particular guidance that I would point individuals to is the CDC has interim guidance on how homeless shelter providers and officials should manage these populations and the shelters, and that's very helpful. There's also guidance for healthcare providers and public health officials who are going into congregate shelters and doing, whether it be contact tracing or doing public health assessments to help them get set up. But this is a very daunting task because of the population. Once again, and Justin and I, we've talked about this with Daniel as well. This is a forgotten population, and this is where public health needs to come together with human services, the decision makers. Justin mentioned emergency managers have a role in this, and it's not particularly emergency management sexy, right? But we really need to all pitch in and solve this problem before it gets any worse.
Thank you, Donnell. You have been providing some links to a lot of this research and guidance. We're just kind of wondering where we could find those. I think they'll be available on the website, and a lot of excellent information to be gleaned there. So, Justin, in last week's webinar, you had described some systems of support for individuals in the midst of a disaster that are able to stay in their own homes for a variety of reasons, which oftentimes is a better option if it's possible. So when we look at the kind of physical facilities of emergency shelters, if they remain viable in a disaster, for earthquake, windstorm, things like that, is there a kind of corollary way that support can be provided? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is, what if they are not capable of remaining viable and they have to be integrated into the disaster shelter systems?
Yeah, so I think one of the first challenges that we all found is when you lower density in shelters, you spread out not just the population, but you spread out the logistics of supporting them. The cost potentially increases, although I think the jury is still out, and it's probably at a local level that it needs to be determined what really the cost is. But you really start stretching the system that you had in place pretty thin. So, right, as you decentralize, there's a cost associated with that, whether it's fiscal or logistical or staffing, what have you. And so that's been a particular challenge for us. And I think that's something that a lot of cities and counties were not necessarily prepared for, is as we expand out, whether we integrate other facilities, schools, rec centers, hotels, we now have to care for those people in those locations. That was a challenge for us. And a compounding challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations, was a lot of municipalities, is that we start out with a public health and safety response to this incident. But a lot of the folks, like Daniel mentioned, that we're trying to protect in the first place, right? So these are not folks who are necessarily COVID positive or have symptoms, but we're trying to put them in a safe space. And I think that's the right thing to do. And I'm really proud of a lot of the communities that have done that work, including Washington and Seattle. But at the same time, you can't provide disaster only rations and housing to folks who are going to be in those single occupancy hotel rooms for the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. And so part of our challenge is, I think, for the next incident, right, is to work out, okay, so we have a public safety mechanism. We have NIMS, we have ICS, we have all these structures that we've spent millions of dollars over 20 years with a lot of FEMA leadership, national leadership, right? Understanding how to respond to these incidents. But then the social services are run in a very different way through our normal government operations. And I think we can figure out a lot of how do we make those systems and services work better in an emergency response to a rapid expansion of needs in social services. Because frankly, I think, as we all learned during this event, I can get a hospital tent and a crane and a bulldozer in 12 hours, but getting a contract to provide snacks and beverages in a hotel, well, wait a minute, that's a little bit, well, do I go through a normal procurement process? Who does this? Where am I going? Are we delivering like one delivery to a hotel, or do they come 3 times a day? Is it hot meals? There's all these things that we really didn't think about because, frankly, we excluded a lot of the human services and social services from our very robust public safety infrastructure for responding to these incidents.
That's a great segue to the question I'm going to pose to Donnell. And we are now kind of pivoting to direct questions that we received from participants. And we will be doing that for the remainder of this session. Again, thank you for so many thoughtful comments and questions. We can't get to them all, but we're going to try, pretty hard to get to the ones that seem to be on more people's minds. And I just want to applaud all of you. I mean, for your dedication, your humanity. You're all SMEs. We just happen to be 4 that have screen time. But again, the ball does not move down the field except for our collective efforts. So Donnell, I'm going to pick up on what Justin just said. I mean, there's a thought about, and this was a term that was used by some of our participants, establishing standards of care. And of course, we've talked about that previously, about the general standards of care. Now you've got, an even more complex population. So who should be at the table to do that? And what are the kind of reasonable parameters? I mean, in a sense, I'm asking who's in charge, or who could convene, the right participative format to establish reasonable standards of care for people experiencing homelessness with co-occurring disorders, either in a new kind of format of emergency shelter, or, as it is the case probably widely in the majority, for the congregate shelters that still exist around the country.
So the federal government obviously plays a huge role in this, and they have had some leadership from the beginning, at least from the CDC, in helping promulgate guidelines. However, we do live in a federalist system, and it's really up to the state and the local health departments to work with their state and local human services to initiate these protections. And once again, I would point everyone to the CDC guidelines. They're pretty solid. And I would tell you if they weren't, they're pretty solid. So as a starting point, the CDC guidelines. Now there's a dynamic to this disaster that's unlike anything we've seen before. And that is, this is the first widespread disaster that we've seen in our country in over 100 years, Most of the disasters we've seen are localized. 9/11, I was in New York City for that. Other disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, community will pull together because they can perceive a common enemy, the fire, the building collapse. In this, the enemy is all around us. It could be in your house, Clark. It can be in my office. It can be wherever we are. And so it's kind of created this tribalistic, every person kind of for themselves. And you'll see that at the state level, where really how the states and the executives of the states choose to follow CDC guidelines and federal guidelines will trickle down to the local level. And so, if you're an independent shelter or an operator, you probably have a lot more latitude to enact certain guidelines than maybe other government entities. With that said, we've all seen the coverage about mask wearing, which is obviously the number one thing that we want to do. Social distancing, which I'm sure is a challenge for those individuals that are running these centers. And what happens when you don't wear masks and you don't social distance is what you'll see when you have an outbreak. And so,
Donnell, just to follow on with a very practical observation, I think when we talk about the enactment or implementation of guidelines, guidelines equals funding, right? And we're in an economic crisis. So I'm not asking you to solve this problem, but, are we not in, as we're discussing, the collaborative decision-making about the need to have really prudent, thoughtful, criteria-driven expenditure of the funds that we have available to us. It's more of a lecture than a question, but I think.
No, it's a great question. It's not just funding, Clark, it's resources. And I will tell you, early on in the pandemic, circa, March, April, I would say, and I will posit this to Daniel and Justin, it's probably a hard sell to governors or mayors to send PPE, to surge PPE and hand sanitizers to homeless shelters. Once again, I started off with a statement that may be provocative, but I think it holds true. This is a forgotten population. And so when you have an environment where you have limited resources and mass competition, unlike we've ever seen before for those limited resources, states fighting states and not necessarily fighting states, but states competing with other states to get these resources, how do you make the sell to take care of families that are in shelters that no one sees? And so there's research, you can look it up, I can share it with you, happened in Seattle of researchers looking at the spread of COVID in congregate shelters. And it spreads particularly effectively, just as effective as it spreads through a home. And you'll see one person has it, then the whole family has it. Congregate shelters are no different. And that's where we really need to earn our money as public health professionals, as public safety professionals, as human services professionals to protect these vulnerable populations.
Great, thank you. Well, Daniel, I think that cued you up pretty well, I think. And so we are very interested in hearing, all right, given the aspirational and practical kind of objectives that you have for the shelter systems, where are you at in the process? What are the challenges? I kind of hasten to point out that you've been sued among, that's the American way, right? The DESC and the county over the facility that you were mentioning. But let's keep on a plane of, well, where do we want to be and what are the likelihood and the things that we need to overcome to get there?
We have reached a state of mind where we don't ever want to go back to the old way. It certainly was never safe for kind of respiratory illness transmission purposes. And it also just wasn't humane for people, especially this high needs population group that, we can predict are going to need this kind of support, survival service support for an extended period of time because the housing is just not available for them. It's going to take a while to get people through and into housing once it becomes available. And so we can't go back even after the pandemic to that old way of doing things. and part of that is related to other respiratory illnesses. I mean, they all come through every year, colds and flus, of course. And I hesitate to say this because it'll horrify Dr. Harvin, our infectious disease expert, and other colleagues in public health, but we've always known that the environment was bad for infectious disease purposes. Our local public health department told us that repeatedly, that really you've got people sleeping way too close together here, and you should spread people out farther. And we rejected that because the clear implication was, well, it means we're going to have fewer people indoors and we're going to have to kick people out to the street. And we assessed that to be a greater risk than the possibility that more colds and flus are going to spread among the shelter environment. And, what a horrible kind of decision to have to make here. And COVID, because it's, more severe, we were more scared of it, forced us finally off of that, and we simply can't go back. But it's easier said than done, because we've got facilities that could cram a bunch of people back into them. We don't have the hotels acquired, although they're available for acquisition because they're empty, basically, and people, owners are losing their shirts over having these assets that they can't operate and make money off of now. But there are both financial and political issues involved with acquiring them, because you need to pay for these properties, and those properties exist in cities and neighborhoods where people have not thought through the implications of suddenly having a homeless shelter, basically, in that location where it's just been a travelers or business hotel. And so it's hard to go through the process of helping people understand what these operations are and how they work, and how they can integrate into the community in a compressed time period. And we're all operating in compressed time periods now. So that's right.
There's two things I'd like you to just talk us through. First is we're not naming names, of course, and jurisdictions and things like that, but you have talked about the temporary acquisition funded through the county of hotel space. How many people were placed in that hotel from your shelter population?
130.
130. So that's
200.
Oh, 230. Okay, that's huge, right? So the location that hotel was, that is in the jurisdiction is file a lawsuit, and I think it went to a hearing examiner. If you talk a little bit about that, because I think that's just going to be a given and as we move forward. But the other is the proposed exercise or option of the county to increase the sales tax by 0.1% to fund these acquisitions, to fund these very programs into the future. And there have been some hiccups and wrinkles in that. So give us, a minute and a half each on those topics. That we'd really appreciate it.
Sure. So the hotel that we moved our downtown Seattle operation into is not in Seattle. It's in a different jurisdiction that had not contemplated that it might create or open a large emergency shelter in their jurisdiction, and so that's brought with it a bunch of concern and worry there. And as Clark mentioned, they're trying to kick us out, basically, that it doesn't comport with their zoning code, and they never had an opportunity to approve it and that kind of thing. And so it's a contentious issue there. And we hope to be able to remain long enough that either the pandemic ends or that we can implement our future vision of never going back to the old crowded congregate way. But that means we've got to find these other properties and acquire them and so forth. And that goes into this thing Clark mentioned, where our local government is attempting to come up with a mechanism to enact that kind of vision, not just for us, but for other shelters, because the leadership in the county government has seen that this has been kind of wildly successful if you want to compare it to the old way. First of all, we've avoided major COVID outbreaks, and those were not avoided in the congregate settings, as has been mentioned. And it's just better. It's a better environment. There are fewer crisis calls and all of that, as I said before. And so the county has just enacted a new sales tax to dedicate funds for this basic purpose, to buy a bunch of hotels that can be operated immediately for shelter purposes, and then ultimately over time be converted into permanent supportive housing for this high needs population experiencing homelessness. Well, the scenario where this got put into a suburban jurisdiction very quickly without their input or agreement has frayed some relationships and caused some, kind of intergovernmental squabbles. And so some communities in our area have opted out of participating in this way, and they were able to, basically because they could enact the sales tax themselves first, and which then would preclude the county from enacting it for their jurisdiction. It's kind of a weird process, but that means that it's cut into the county's ability to enact this on a larger scale and to enact it in those jurisdictions that, kind of swept in and undercut the county on enacting it. So, these citing of homelessness programs in general can be controversial. I've been through a lot of these things. Doing it in a hurry in places that aren't used to having it done in, it just brings up all kinds of challenging issues to deal with.
Yep. So Justin, we've been now just talking about use of alternate facilities to the shelters that we're so familiar with, and particularly hotel, motel rooms. There are others to consider as well, skilled nursing facilities, offices. I mean, there's all kinds of options, but nevertheless, let's put on your emergency manager's hat. And so suppose you have a truly catastrophic set of circumstances, an incident or scenario, you too rely on the use of some of the same facilities that Daniel's describing. What's the deconfliction process? I mean, and are you concerned right now? Plenty of hotel rooms. Post-COVID, what's the vacancy rate in Washington, D.C. in the summer times? About 89, 90%. So what's the real world look like for you as you're considering the housing, general housing, disaster housing challenges, and how do we deconflict that? How do we get at the table, like I asked Donnell, and figure out a strategic vision that everybody will look at and go, yes, that works?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the first thing is that we've clearly reprioritized sheltering people in place during disasters as much as humanly possible, where we used to tell people to come to us and we would, open up a convention center or a school gym or something and do congregate settings. We're now focused more on, okay, well, let's turn those logistics around and how can we provide that to keep people in place as much as possible. Another issue that has come up a number of times is, do we have shelter that's just for people who are experiencing homelessness versus shelter that's for people who are not experiencing homelessness? That's not in line with our values in my jurisdiction and probably in a lot of other jurisdictions. And so I tend to look at it as high needs and low needs shelter. And because people with high needs are both in our homeless population and also at home taking care of themselves or relying on services that come to them. And so I think looking at that from that standpoint, if we have a disaster, categorizing people into the level of service that they require to keep them safe is something that we can do. We certainly are going to have a challenge with hotels. And I think, a lot of what Daniel said really highlights for me the difference between, and this is an interesting clash that I think a lot of us have experienced during this event, is the difference between the social service way of looking at things and those of us who come from a public safety background. So from the social service side, we're all saying, oh my God, we're never going back to the way that we did things. We can't do that. It's not the right thing to do. And that's all well and good. And I think a lot of cities, and I'm not here representing the district, but I come from a very progressive city that has invested a tremendous amount into this. So does Daniel, right? But our job as public safety and emergency management professionals to say like, okay, well, until you do that, what are the systems and business processes that we're going to have in place that we can pull on a short trigger to make sure that we do the best job possible? And I think, just to close this out, one of the things that I would, I try to keep an eye on, well, what are the solutions to these things, right? Not just what are all the problems we're experiencing, but one of the biggest things that I think I would encourage everybody on this call right now to do, and Donnell mentioned this in the last webinar, start your after action process. Start writing down the things that are working for you and start writing down the controversial things that are not working for you and the outstanding questions. Because we've got a lot of federal guidance, we've got some county and state guidance, but a lot of times what we really struggle with, and I know a lot of people have asked questions about this, is how does that translate into really tactical level issues for me managing? I've never opened up a hotel before, and now all of a sudden I own 3 of them, or in the last case, we had 293 of them, right? And so we need a lot of very specific guidance. Who is helping us translate those general standards that FEMA and CDC are giving us? That's helpful, but how do we turn that into, I think somebody asked a question about how many bathrooms do we need, and what kind of congregate space, and do we take people to their doctor's appointments? And these are the kinds of questions that we need to start answering for ourselves. And so the first step in that is please writing those things down, because I guarantee we're all going to forget them. By this time next year, we will have forgotten, and it'll be too late. We'll be reinventing the wheel. So save that institutional knowledge and then come back and share those best practices with each other. And I'm sorry, one other thing, Clark, I just wanted to mention, there's a lot of things that we haven't looked into yet. I think the jury is still out on things like cohorting versus individual rooms, right? There's a lot of questions out there that we need we need data for, both epidemiological data and also the sort of core human service data about what we've been doing and what's working and where we're seeing outbreaks.
Great, thank you, Justin. And Donnell knows I was going to come to him because you were championing the idea of doing after action reports when the action's still ongoing. I think combining some of the things that we've been talking about today, looking at, well, who undertakes that? How do we make sure that it's a complete picture? What's the dynamic that emerges from that? Who are the leaders? Who are the vital kind of champions of these initiatives? And how are they participating in an ongoing, real-time, in the midst of the crisis analysis?
Yeah, that's great. We talked about this the last seminar, in which generally you write after action after the action is done, but the action will be protracted, and now is an opportunity to look back while you're still in it and to see what worked. If we can do a quick rapid fire follow-up, Clark, there's 2 things that we really haven't hit on, and I'd like Justin and Daniel to speak to them if they can. One is what we didn't get to the last seminar, which is what are your security issues? In particular, from a public health standpoint as well, depending on what research you look at, anywhere from 70 to 85% of the persistent homeless population are experiencing either a mental health, a substance abuse, or physical, or trifecta of those things. How does that work when you don't have eyes on them, and now you're putting them in a location that no one's monitoring them from a resource standpoint? The second thing I'd ask you is, Clark, and all of you articulated the fact that, once again, I'm gonna say the CDC has great guidelines, but there's so much the federal government can do at the state and local level. And often people will pick up those guidelines and say, how do I interpret this? What does that mean for my shelter? And that's where your local and state health department come in. My question is, the local and state health department is overtaxed with doing public health measures. And so who do you turn to in that regards? When you pick up the phone and say, hey, can you send someone over? Can you help us out? Can you do this assessment? And they're doing contact tracing, they're doing public messaging, they're working with nursing homes and hospitals. There's a limited resource you're fighting against.
Great, thank you. Well, who wants to take them? I think those are 2 very, very good questions. Daniel, do you want to kind of
Yeah, I'll
start
take
with
a
that?
stab at that first part about safety and security and monitoring of things. So uh, yeah, homeless shelters are not just spaces that are opened up for people to be in. And so there's, of course, a range of people experiencing homelessness in terms of their level of functioning and, independence and so forth. My organization is focused on serving people at, kind of the end of the spectrum who have much more profound needs and require a fair amount of supervision sometimes, but support generally. And that for us means 24/7 support with paid staff who are there to do everything from keeping a lid on things to observing if there's some kind of conflict that needs intervention to helping somebody who starts to exhibit signs of going into a psychiatric crisis, a whole array of things, and you got to have workers for that stuff. And as I said earlier, early in the pandemic, we started to rent some motel rooms just in regular motels, not where we're going in and running it. We had a limited number of clients that we serve who are appropriate for those kinds of environments, people we could check in with once in a while in a kind of case management way, but who we weren't going to be providing oversight for. Most of our folks don't fall into that category. So we needed to move our whole operations, including our staff. And that dramatically limits how much more we can expand all of this kind of work. Even if more money can flow quickly and we can get a hold of facilities quickly, we have to have a workforce who knows what they're doing, namely that they're experienced in serving people who have sometimes challenging behaviors. And they're not always there for, bringing on, or we may not have the, kind of structure in place to quickly hire and orient and train people to be effective at this kind of work. Real challenge.
Great, thank you. So Justin, we have an overworked public health system that we still depend upon for guidance and guidelines. You got the last comment before we turn to Dawn for a lot of really good live questions that we're receiving. Again, we only have limited amount of time, but your thoughts on where's Daniel going to turn?
Yeah, so I think this is a good time to point out, a lot of us, again, we say this all the time, right? You can pay for this now or you can pay for this later. And so this is a time to recognize that a lot of these disasters, right? There's a lot of folks with big hats and shiny badges, and a lot of folks have been public safety for a long time, and a lot of people, like me, who are happy and comfortable making big sloppy command decisions like, let's open up a hotel. But the heroes of this response are not the people who are saying, let's open up a hotel. It's the people who are saying, sitting down and diving into the nitty gritty of the contracts to do that, to have those vehicles in place, right? Like the folks in New York City and their fire departments and city management team like to say that, without logistics, it's all just a dream, right? And so the same is true with our contracting and procurement, right? This is all risk management. It's funding based. We have to think about what are our city's disaster workforces so that we can expand. I can open up a hotel, but if I don't have staff for it, it's not going to be a very safe and happy place for people to live. And so we need to start diving into those less exciting sounding issues of collective bargaining agreements and contracting procurement to be able to bring on the health professionals, the mental health professionals, the security contractors, right? To move these people. So we have to have all of those administrative things worked out. And I think, honestly, if you ask me, that's probably the single biggest impact that we could have, is to dive into those details, because this is about nuance, right? Dive into those details and have those things ready to go so we don't have to relearn these lessons on the fly. And we're ready to redeploy staff from other agencies. We're ready to modify contracts, or it's already in our contracts for the folks that run our shelters to be able to expand and to work out of public facilities, or to switch from, hot congregate feeding to single individually packed meals or what have you. So let's get those things in place so that we don't expend 80% of our energy on that administrative stuff the next time, and we can just focus on doing what the right thing to do for these populations is.
Great. I'd like to turn to Dawn. She is our voice of the rest of our SMEs, our participants today, and there's a number of questions. Dawn?
Thanks, Clark. A quick programming note for folks. Lots of questions about the resources, documents, and research that have been mentioned by the panel today. We're posting links to several of those in the Q&A box during the session, and all of those documents will be available links on the webinar website afterwards. So just a reminder, if you didn't see it today, we'll get those posted and everyone can research and look at those on your own time. First set of questions, actually a collection of questions here for our panel about any recommendations that you have, particularly for local, state, county, nonprofit organizations who might not traditionally be in this housing game, disaster sheltering or helping those who are experiencing homelessness. Any recommendations for the panel for funding resources, expertise resources, or human resources, looking to VOADs, CERT teams, or other folks who might not traditionally have supported a mission like this, but might be called upon now, both funding and personnel?
Donnell, why don't you start answering that one or addressing that one? I'd actually like to also turn to Daniel, time permitting, for some observations about.
Well, I mean, that's the key, right? That's why emergency managers get a check. It's to help agencies and organizations get funds, get resources, particularly in a resource poor environment. And so there's I haven't checked, but I'm going to assume that every single state has a state level EOC activated from early on in this incident. And what Justin's spoken with about is getting those human services and those mental health providers integrated into that process. Perhaps it's getting ICS training for them so they can understand the lingo, so they understand how to submit a prescriptive mission request or resource request. Getting those individuals in front of the emergency managers, and often it's not the private sector providers that are represented in these EOCs. It's often the very state or government county level providers, and a lot of provisions are being made at the private sector level. So we need to integrate better, I think.
Thank you, Daniel. You on the question of, well, where are the resources to help us work through and think through these things? Well, you do an awful lot around the country by way of technical assistance, and you have a lot of colleagues that do that. I mean, there's a network, right, that could bring the focus on the questions that, like, even like rural communities and maybe more non-traditional partners, CERT teams, the community emergency response teams, et cetera. So any just quick thoughts on that, and we need to get to another question.
Yeah, well, one thing that occurs to me that is kind of an interesting twist on this is that a lot of social services are done using philanthropic dollars, private fundraising. They aren't necessarily seen as part of the local, government system of, community care. That's not really true of my organization. We raise private dollars, but mostly we operate under government contracts, and we're kind of in a larger urban area where that's possible. But I think in rural areas and also in the urban areas in some ways, a lot of this stuff is done through philanthropic dollars, and those organizations are not generally in a place to just scale up quickly, take on a lot of additional work, and even the ones, I can speak for myself as a largely government contract funded provider. When something strange comes down the pike, like this pandemic, we're looking for guidance. We are looking for who is in charge that is going to tell us what needs to be done and give us some sense of where we can be most helpful, where we can flex, where we can change, where we can stop certain things. We can come up with our own ideas and make suggestions in the process, but we want somebody that's at the helm of all of this stuff. And I think Donnell said it very well that for the most part, we're not normally part of these systems of emergency management, kind of thinking. And so we don't have a lot of relationships there, and, and they don't know us either. And so I think establishing all of us together, maybe in the off times better would probably help a lot for being better prepared when these.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, what you just said is one of the headlines of this webinar today. And we've talked a lot about collaboration, but we're talking about very purposeful collaboration, and creating that relationship with the emergency management community seems to me one of the most important single and probably not that daunting steps to undertake. Don?
We also have a lot of questions here, Clark, about screening, particularly in congregate sites, and any advice from the panelists on not just the screening capability, but if testing is not available for residents who may leave and return on a daily basis, how do you handle those?
I think I'll give that one to Justin.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I wish there was an easy answer for this. So the first thing that I want to mention is that I think this is what a lot of what emergency management planners can do to help the situation is you have to look at what is the cascading effect of the decisions that we make, right? So if you're going to screen people at the door, that's great. But if somebody's symptomatic or somebody says that they think that they are COVID positive or they're a close contact, well, what do you do with them? You can't just say we screen and then walk away. And I think that's a big lesson for a lot of communities. And so you have to walk through that whole thing. And that's where that collaboration and partnership comes in. What subset of those folks will go to a hotel? What subset will go to a hospital? Are we doing some level of cohorting of folks inside of those facilities? So do you have a location or a wing or somewhere where you can put folks who are, symptomatic but negative? There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do it. And again, this is where we need, folks like me are looking for public health advice. We can come up with ideas, but we need a public health entity to say, yes, this makes sound medical sense as well. So we're looking for that. I think this is where the emergency management community has to step in and create that cohesion there. But yeah, I mean, I think, we're pretty much all doing screening at this point, right? Even if we're just asking people about their symptoms. The more, when we have the resources, we're doing temperature checks and those sorts of things, but we have to be able to do it. We have to have the staff to do it. In some cases, we have staff that say, hey, that's medical and I don't do medical stuff. I'm a security guard. So we got to work out a lot of those issues about what are these responsibilities that folks have. What do we do with them? And then what do we do when there's lack of compliance, right? And that's something that Donnell's harped on. When somebody says, you know what, I don't care, I have a fever, I'm coming in. Well, now what, right? So we're not going to arrest that person and take them to central booking. So what are we doing with them? I think the plans have to be inclusive. I think it's probably going to be a mix of having isolation, not actual isolation rooms, but rooms for people to isolate in, having some sense of cohorting. I think in the next round of COVID, God forbid we have this again soon, that we need to be thinking about how do we incorporate that cohorting process in there. And it also begs the question of what other facilities do we start including? So do we do cohorting in different facilities for some groups of people and where others are more isolated or in single occupancy rooms, et cetera?
Great, thank you. Don, maybe one more, I think?
Sure, we've got a lot of questions here asking for advice from the panelists. If your housing and sheltering plans are changing dramatically as we enter into the cold weather months. Again, Daniel mentioned this earlier, but what are specific steps that you all are considering or might recommend for jurisdictions who are going to have congregate care because of the cold weather, and how to address those?
Daniel, you want to start with that? I mean, we have our mild climate here in Seattle, but there are some pretty severe weather effects around the country, and particularly like in rural areas.
Yeah,
maybe Donnell could close it out.
It's super scary to think about people being, all brought indoors all of a sudden together in the shared space. So, hopefully the emphasis is going to be on getting people into individual rooms or, cohort spaces, as Justin was mentioning. Some of the other things you can do and you can think about come down to things like meal provision. The more meal provision you can provide, the more meal you can provide to people, at the service location, the less people have to be out and about in the community and, coming in contact with more people. And the more you can do meals that are pre-packed or individually, prepared so that people can they don't have to go through a line, together, and they don't have to sit down and eat together. That's just more opportunity to sort of keep people away from each other. I think that, has the potential to avoid some unnecessary contact. I mean.
Danielle, your thoughts? I think this might be the as many as we can get to, and then we'll work toward our summary.
Yeah, so I'm probably going to get in copyright trouble, but winter is coming, right? And infectious disease spread from communicable diseases, respiratory diseases spread more in the winter. We all know that as people come indoors. Shelters need to be aggressive and start lining up now, your hand sanitizers, making sure that people are wearing masks at all times, giving people enough room to socially distance, especially when they're sleeping, and making sure that they're wearing masks even when they're sleeping. The fact of the matter is you're going to be hard pressed to turn people away in inclement weather. The other fact of the matter is that symptoms aren't always prevalent when people are infectious. We know that. That's why this disease is pernicious and predacious, is because any one of us in this chat right now could have it and not know about it. And so the best thing we can do is make sure there's good infection control, good hygiene, hand sanitizers, keeping people from congregating, even in family settings, and making sure that masks are being worn at all times. Because by all, and I'm not an expert in COVID, I should have said that before, but by everyone, all my colleagues and everything I'm consuming, we're going to have a rough winter.
Right. Well, let's, out of respect for all of our, our other SMEs in our participant gallery, we want to be respectful of their time. I'd like to just ask each of you maybe a 1-minute lightning summary kind of round. The question I posed to you is a question I got from Donnell, which is, if you knew a year ago what you know today, what would be the top things you'd be like working on to implement, correcting, changing, editing, amending, or discarding? Why don't we start with Donnell?
I'd probably move to South Korea where there's a low infection rate. No, I think that this has really been, and once again, if you ask an expert, I think we're probably halfway through this. That's my just a personal unscientific. I don't think we're going to emerge from this COVID thing until April in a meaningful way. And then I believe because of the resistance against compliance with COVID measures, whether they be masks or social distancing or an eventual vaccine, I think we'll be living with COVID for many, many, many years. It will be endemic in this country as well as many other countries. I think what this has shown is that public health, emergency management, politicians, human services, mental health workers really all need to come together to have these tough discussions and to make sure that proper funding, and Justin alluded to this, Justin and I, where he can say this, we were first responders many years ago, so we understand the allure of spending a lot of money in trucks and training and tactical stuff, but where you save lives is what we're talking about here. Where you make a difference is in this population. And so hopefully this has changed the calculus of many of those who control the purse strings to spend more money in avenues like this that don't get a whole lot of attention.
Great, thank you. Justin?
Yeah, I think, I'll piggyback off of Donnell. I think I probably would have worked harder to bridge the gap between social services and emergency management. And I think, even for somebody like me who naturally sort of lies at the nexus of that in my current position, I think a lot of us just really, we looked at the homeless population as a population that we already have a sort of semi-custodial relationship with in some circumstances, that they're already enrolled in social services. They're already in our shelter system. They're taken care of in one way or another by our social service agencies. And I think what we're realizing is what's the complexity when that population becomes a part of the broader public safety response. And I think I would have advocated much stronger that we use our investment in public safety funds in order to make that population more resilient to these kinds of shocks. And I don't think we're going to live in a sort of COVID safety world for the rest of our lives. But I think that our real responsibility here is to reduce the gap between the way that we normally live and the way that we live when we're taking pandemic precautions. And so if we can narrow that gap through social engineering, physical engineering, the investments that we make in our social services, I think we'll have done a pretty good job of advancing this cause.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Daniel.
So here I am right now with a very strong intent to kill the Congregate shelter. I don't want them, at least for homelessness purposes. I can see the necessity for Congregate shelters that are set up very quickly for disasters and are shut down very quickly in those kinds of situations. For homelessness, which is an ongoing disaster, I don't think they're appropriate anymore. And so a year ago, if I had known what was about to transpire, laying the groundwork for that, I think would have been well advised, because it's all been done seat of the pants. And we didn't go into this with a plan that people knew about, that, look, if it comes down this way, here's the action that we need to take very quickly to have a homelessness care system that is not going to rely on that old model of cramming people into shared spaces anymore.
Thank you. Well, thank you, all of our panelists. Like most of these webinars, I end up learning a whole lot just listening to all of you, and then obviously contemplating the questions that our participants have been sending us. We're going to try and get back to all the participants we can, humanly possible, because when the screen goes blank, we do not want this conversation to end. We're at the beginning of some pretty important work, and I think we've seen some examples of that, as well as some gaps and needs that we need to vigorously address. As Donnell points out, we've got a long haul in front of us, and I think that our work does not end in any kind of peremptory sort of way. It's going to be for years. So these lessons learned, which we should be collecting as we're going along, are going to be lifesavers for our civic, society, for our individuals, people we care about, our families, our loved ones. So thanks to everybody. And this is, again, a very, very interesting conversation. As a reminder, the link to this recording today will be available on the CHDS Executive Education Program website following today's session, along with the links to many of the things that we talked about today. And last but not least, we invite you to join us for the third installment of this series. On Friday, October 23rd, we will discuss the complexities of managing congregate jail and prison populations during the pandemic. So we've got a shelter theme running through these very, very important topics. On behalf of the Naval Postgraduate School for Center for Homeland Defense and Security and our co-hosts at ASTO, IAEM, NEMA, and the CHDS Alumni Association, and a tip of the hat to our funders and sponsors and administrators at FEMA, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us. Be safe, and we applaud your dedication to humanity every single day.